The airfield was a corpse, a vast, horizon-spanning cemetery of metal skeletons, beneath a sky the color of bruises and ash. The ground was scorched to the ground, strewn with the ripped-open fuselages of bombers and the twisted remains of fighters. In the center of this devastation, a single runway had been cleared, and at its end stood a lone fighter. An old Falcon, its gray skin like canvas, riddled with welding scars and patches. It didn't look like a war machine. It resembled a wounded animal forced out on a final desperate hunt. Inside the trembling command bunker, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and fear. Captain Alexei Iron Gromov stood motionless in front of the large radar screen. 30 bright, hostile blips formed a solid, unstoppable wall of light, creeping toward the only remaining important object on the map, the Volkov Industrial Complex, the last beating heart. The commander's voice was dry and hoarse, devoid of any hope. The math is simple, Gromov. There are 30 of them. We are you. That's all we have. Today you are not a pilot. You are a statistic. The only variable in a hopeless equation. Your life is worth 10,000 people at the plant. Alexei's life already felt like a ghost. He was haunted by a single ghost, the ghost of his wingman, Mikhail. It was always there, a cold presence at his shoulder. He could still feel the shock of the explosion, see that same blinding, soundless flash in the blackness of space that was Mikhail's ship. He could still hear the last distorted crackle in his headphones, his own name, cut off by the void. The scream that was his fault, his miscalculation, his order. He was about to turn around. He was about to utter the word that would end his career, his legend, but preserve what remained of his soul. But then the radar operator, a young woman with a chalky face, said in a trembling voice, "Sir, transponder code confirmed on the lead scraper. This is Reaper 1. The name struck Alexei with the force of a physical blow. Reaper 1! It wasn't just a call sign. It was the very same specific, marked bomber that had executed that pincer maneuver, caught Mikhail's tail, that had launched the deadly projectile. This was the ship that carried the pilot who had killed his brother. Mikhail's ghost was no longer a cold memory. It ignited in his chest into a white-hot rage. This was no longer a suicide mission ordered by command. It was a summons, a personal invitation to the reckoning he'd prayed for every night for a year. He turned and silently walked out of the bunker. The technicians didn't look at him with pity. They looked at him as if he had already become something else, something more than human. A weapon, a specter of vengeance. He climbed into the Falcon's cockpit, his movements precise, mechanical, fueled by cold, focused rage. He buckled himself in. The seatbelts clicked with a final click. He ran through the pre-flight checks, looking not at the instruments, but at the horizon, where his target awaited him. The engine coughed, then roared with a deafening, booming roar that shook the very air. The plane shuddered, as if impatient, as if it too understood the essence of this hunt. Alexei's hand closed on the throttle. He wasn't thinking about the 29 other bombers. He was thinking only of one thing. Reaper 1! He pushed the lever forward. The Falcon shot down the runway, a silver arrow released from a broken bow. It rose into the heavy, oppressive sky, its sound quickly fading, swallowed by a vast, expectant silence. This wasn't a plane taking off. This was a soul departing for its final furious judgment. The silence at high altitude was a deception, a fragile veil over the chaos brewing below the cloud line. Alexei's Falcon hung in the blinding rays of the sun, a predator using light as camouflage. Below it, in the breaks in the clouds, the enemy armada moved like a slow, metallic river. They were confident. Their formation was like a funeral procession. The escort fighters, swift vipers, darted around the massive bombers like pilot fish around sharks, their radars painting the empty sky with predictable, arrogant patterns. Alexei's breathing was a steady, controlled rhythm in the sterile air of the cockpit. His eyes were glued to the tactical display, but his mind was elsewhere. He didn't see the data points or the trajectory. He heard Mikhail's voice from a year ago, during exercises above the craggy peaks of Orion. They always look down, Alexei. It never occurs to them to look up. The sun is your best wingman. A ghost's advice. Now, his only strategy. He switched his systems to passive mode, becoming a silent, listening shadow. He watched the lead flight of Vipers complete their lazy turn. They were complacent. They were masters of this sky. He waited. He counted down the seconds. The moment the last Viper turned its tail towards him, the Falcon's nose lifted and dived into the clouds below. The world dissolved into a swirling, oppressive gray darkness. The only sound was the howl of the wind against the canopy. He flew blind, using instruments and instinct, counting down the seconds to the intercept point he'd calculated. The ghost was with him, a calm presence in the co-pilot's seat, who wasn't there. 3, 2, 1, now. He burst out of the cloud bank just behind and below the trailing pair of Vipers. They couldn't see him, their radars scanning ahead and to the sides. For 3 precious seconds, he was invisible. His sights fell on the first Viper. A short, precise burst from the cannon. The enemy ship didn't explode. It shattered, its fuselage torn like paper, scattering metal and flame into the void. The Viper's co-pilot, stunned by the sudden debris, tore out of formation, banking desperately. A mistake. Alexei had anticipated the panic. He didn't follow it into a bank. He crossed its trajectory, anticipating its maneuver and firing another burst. The second Viper disappeared in a brief, furious bloom of orange and black. Chaos ensued. The enemy communications, now loud in his headphones, devolved into a frantic jumble of confused shouts. They didn't know where he was. He was a ghost, a phantom. He dove back into the clouds before they could organize a counterattack. It was a dance. He wasn't engaging in combat. He was conducting a symphony of terror. He used the cloud layers like theater curtains. He hid in the radar shadows of the massive bombers themselves. He would emerge from a blind spot, a sudden and furious vision, destroy one target with surgical precision, and vanish again before the enemy could lock onto him with a follow-up missile. He decimated their numbers not with brute force, but with psychological warfare. He made them fear the empty sky. But with each new victory, a cold confidence grew within him. He was a magician, running out of tricks. His ammunition counter was dwindling. A warning light flickered on his console, a minor hydraulic leak from a stray burst. The Falcon was bleeding. He broke away, climbing again, toward the sun, for a final respite. He had destroyed 8 of the 12 Vipers. A stunning, impossible result. But it mattered not. The core of the Armada, 30 star scrapers, remained intact. And there, at the very center of the formation, flew his true target. Reaper 1. It was larger than the others, the command ship, its hull bristling with defensive turrets, now activated, scanning the surrounding space, waiting for it to reveal itself. He had run out of tricks. He was out of time. Ghost tactics had led him to the gates of hell, but they couldn't get him through. There were no more tricks left. And Reaper 1 was still flying, untouched, impregnable, its course leading inexorably to the Volkovo complex. The real battle hadn't even begun. The Falcon shuddered from a new wave of turbulence caused by the Armada's wake. Alexei used his last trick, a desperate maneuver around the bomber's starboard side, using its mass as a shield from the missile lock-on. It worked, but it brought him face to face with the true nature of his enemy. Reaper 1 wasn't just a bomber, he was a fortress. His dark, angular hull was studded with reinforced armor and numerous pulse laser turrets, each now independently rotating, their cold blue lenses seeking him out. This was the heart of the Armada, and it was protected by a wall of pure, technological dominance. A new, colder voice cut through the enemy communications, replacing the panicked chatter of the Viper pilots. It was calm, methodical, emotionless. It was the voice of Reaper 1's commander. All escort aircraft, withdraw and form a defensive perimeter. He's mine. The remaining Vipers pulled back, obeying the order. Alexei was left alone on the battlefield with a single goal, and the target was ready for him. He throttled back, entering a combat course. A barrage of laser fire erupted from Reaper 1. It wasn't aimed fire, it was a calculated energy network, designed to saturate the space in front of him. Alexei spun the Sokol, feeling the G-forces press him into his seat. Sirens blared. A near-explosion warning sounded as a laser blast burned through the space centimeters from his canopy, leaving a scorched mark on the transparent steel. He pulled the trigger on his cannon, holding it, unleashing everything he had in one continuous burst, aimed at the bomber's command compartment. The armor-piercing rounds struck their target, erupting in a blinding, continuous flash of light and fire. He saw them impact and dissipate. A shimmering hexagonal energy field became visible for a moment around the bomber's critical sections. Shield generator. The intel hadn't mentioned shields. His ammunition counter reached 0. The cannon fell silent. The sudden silence in the cabin was more deafening than any siren. His chest tightened. A cold fist of disbelief. He had lost. He had poured all his skill, every trick, every last bullet into the attack, and he hadn't even left a scratch. The emotionless voice came over the airwaves again, this time on an open channel, addressing him personally. Transmission from Reaper 1. Nice try, little ghost. But that's where the story ends. The Volkov complex will be a crater in 10 minutes. The connection was lost. The bomber formation began lightly adjusting, entering the final stretch of the bombing run. They ignored him. He was no longer a threat. He was a spectator. Alexei tore his ship away, his mind racing. He tried to contact base, calling for any kind of support, an anti-aircraft battery, another pilot, anything. All he got was static. The crushing weight of absolute loneliness fell upon him. He was alone, utterly alone. He looked at the instrument panel. The Falcon was dying. The hydraulic leak was getting worse. Fuel was critically low. The ship was a collection of failing systems, held together by rust and sheer willpower. He had no options left, no weapons left, no time left. Mikhail's ghost was silent now. There was no advice, no wisdom for this. There was only the cold, harsh reality of the fortress before him and the inevitable death of thousands below. He had only one thing left, the Falcon itself. A few tons of metal, fuel, and fury. He was no longer a fighter. He was a projectile. The math, as the commander had said, was simple. 1 life for 10,000. The final variable would be himself. The screech of the sirens faded into a distant, insignificant hum. The erratic flashing of the warning lights became a slow, rhythmic pulse, like the last heartbeats of a great beast. Inside the cockpit, only a deep, chilling silence reigned. Alexei's breathing slowed, his hands resting lightly on the controls. The white-hot rage that had fueled him vanished, burned away in the fire of the failed attack. What remained was something colder, harder, and more absolute. Perfect, crystalline clarity. He looked at the Reaper 1 fortress, now turning with majestic, arrogant slowness for its final approach to the target. It was no longer an enemy ship. It was a variable in a physics problem. Mass, speed, trajectory. His eyes slid over the dying console. He still had maneuvering thrusters. A few liters of fuel. The Falcon's mass. And gravity. The voice of his old instructor, long buried under years of war, surfaced in his mind. Clear and academic. The most vulnerable point of any battleship isn't the conning tower or the engines. It's the junction of its control surfaces. The tail, cut off the head, and the body might still convulse. Cut off the tail, and it becomes a falling stone. A plan formed in his mind, cold and precise. This wasn't a suicidal ramming. This was a surgical strike, his final tactical maneuver. He throttled forward not to attack but to gain altitude. The strained engines whined, but obeyed. He rose above the armada, soaring once more into the blinding shelter of the sun. He needed altitude. He needed potential energy. From this point, the entire formation lay beneath him, like a diagram on a tactical screen. Reaper 1 was at the center, a perfect, slow-moving target. He saw its massive tail fin adjusting subtly, guiding its enormous mass. He shut down the main engine. The roar ceased, plunging the cockpit into an ominous, absolute silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind against the canopy. He was no longer a pilot. He was a bullet in a chamber. He lowered the Falcon's nose, aiming it directly at the junction of the Reaper 1's tail plane and its main fuselage. He wasn't diving. He was leveling off. He fired the thrusters in short, precise pulses, making microscopic adjustments to his angle of attack. The targeting computer was dead. Now he was the computer. G-forces began to build, pressing him into his seat. The air behind the canopy began to heat up, a faint orange glow drifting at the edges of his vision. He was in a controlled, silent fall from the sky, a spear of vengeance aimed with mathematical precision. He didn't brace himself for impact. He kept his eyes open, his hands steady on the controls, making the last, tiny adjustment. He saw the bomber's engineering components rushing toward him. There was no fear. There was only the satisfaction of a perfectly solved equation. The Falcon struck not with a blind, explosive blow, but with the crushing precision of a scalpel. The fighter's reinforced nose, designed to penetrate enemy armor, passed straight through the complex web of control cables and hydraulic systems at the base of the tail fin. The sound was not a deafening explosion, but a catastrophic, metallic screech, the sound of a giant's death. For a single frozen instant, the Falcon sank into the shattered tail structure, a metallic parasite delivering a deadly bite. Then the laws of physics took effect. Iziki, the force of the collision, combined with the bomber's own monstrous speed, tore the Sokol apart. The cockpit was torn from the fuselage, hurtling into the void, while the bomber, its control system destroyed, began a slow, irreversible turn into an uncontrollable dive. The universe was a silent, spinning carousel. The Sokol's mangled cockpit tumbled through the void, a mangled fragment caught in the gentle, indifferent currents of space. Inside, strapped to his seat, Alexei Gromov was weightless. Blood congealed into perfect, crimson spheres before his face, shimmering like tiny planets in the light of the distant sun. There was no sound, no pain, only an immense, all-encompassing silence. Through the cracked canopy, he watched his legacy unfold in a series of silent, panoramic images. He saw Reaper 1, a mighty fortress, pull away from the Armada. Its uncontrolled turn turned into a furious, deadly tailspin, dragging it down into the planet's gravity well. It didn't explode. It was a wounded Leviathan, dying in a long, agonizing fall. He saw the remnants of the Starscraper Armada, their flawless formation shattered. Without their command ship, their guiding mind, they became headless snakes. Some began to abort their approach, drifting off course in confusion. Others faltered, becoming easy targets for the ground defenses, which now finally opened, aimed fire on them. The wall of death was shattered. The equation was solved. On the ground, far below, the picture was different. In the streets around the Volkovo complex, people pointed to the sky. They watched as the lead bomber, the Great Reaper the Y, belched smoke and flames, spiraled out of control and fell into the desolate mountains miles away. A colossal fireball blossomed on the horizon, a false dawn that meant they would live to see the present. There was no jubilation. First, a collective, stunned silence. Then a murmur of disbelief, which grew into a wave of desperate, grateful sobs. They had been saved by a miracle they could not comprehend. Returning to the void, Alexei's drifting cabin entered the upper atmosphere. A faint orange glow began to lick the torn metal edges. He felt a faint warmth. He thought of Mikhail. The ghost was no more. There was no debt to repay. There was only a quiet reunion awaiting him in that silence. He had not simply avenged his friend. He saluted him. He had completed their flight. He closed his eyes as the glow outside grew brighter, not in a fiery cataclysm, but like a warm embrace. The last thing he saw wasn't fire or metal, but a memory, the clear blue sky of before the war, without contrails, without fear, only an endless, peaceful azure. The cockpit and the man inside it became a brief, bright streak of light, a final fleeting signature in the atmosphere. Then it was gone. Consumed not by destruction, but by transition. At the airfield below, a young radar operator watched as the single fading blip on her screen vanished forever. She slowly removed her headphones. In the new, deep silence of the command bunker, she could hear, distantly, the growing sound of life from the city they had saved. It was the sound of a future bought with one impossible act of defiance. In that moment, a legend was born, not of a man who died, but of a man who chose, with cold, final precision, to ensure that others could live.